Ready? Okay. Good morning, everyone. This is our symposium, Supply Chain Equities, Modern Slavery, Architecture and Construction. This is the end of a really interesting road for Ambassador DeBaca and me, who met several years ago and decided to start working on this problem. The symposium, we'll go over the organization of the symposium in a couple of minutes. I just wanted to give a few introductory remarks before we kind of get into the meat of this question. So several years ago, it was, what was it, Lou, like five years ago, Lou and I were part of this working group at Grace Farms that was doing work on modern slavery, and we met at one of the sessions that Sharon Prince was running, and we had this idea that there might be a way of looking at the problem of forced labor in the larger structures of the building industry from a different perspective, from a perspective of the agency of designers. And so we talked to Sharon about this, and she gave us a little bit of money, and we taught a sort of little experimental course 5 years ago that was kind of a probe, actually, more than anything else. And Lou and I, at that time, Lou was at the Gilder Lehrman Center working with David as the fellow there and teaching at the law school. And we thought, you know what, let's go after a grant. Let's see if we can get some money to teach this question that we're interested in a longer way. And so we filled out a lot of paperwork to fill out a grant for a Niarchos Foundation subsidy from the law school. And we thought, well, we're the teeny little architecture school and they're the giant law school, and nothing is going to happen, but we're going to do this anyway. And we filled out our grant application, and while we were waiting to hear from the law school, the University of Michigan hired Lou away from Yale, and he went back to his alma mater to become a professor in the practice. And then we heard that we'd gotten the grant. So Lou went to my dean was very supportive, but Lou went to his dean and said, happy to be here. What were you going to teach? Crim? You're going to teach crim, but I'm kind of signed up to teach this course at Yale. And his dean said, fine, you can link the two classrooms and teach a class in parallel on both campuses. So that's what we've been doing for the last several years. And the last iteration of this course, you can see here up on the screen, was called Fighting Slavery in the Building Supply Chain. And our pedagogical idea was kind of weird. What we did was we built a seminar in the fall that was a combination of architecture students and law students and a bunch of other folks from Michigan under a project they run there called the Problem Solving Initiative. You'll hear more about that from Bridget, where professional students work on real problems. So we had artists and social workers and architecture students and lawyers and a couple of computer science people. It was a crazy combination of folks. I'm sorry? Oh, and Griffin Black, of course, who's here from the law school, one of our students. And it was nuts because our idea was the first semester students would pick an issue in this question of forced labor, and then they would set up a problem and set up an information infrastructure that our second semester students in an advanced design studio here at the School of Architecture would then work on as a spatial problem. So the first year, working with Professor Blight, we worked on the question of monuments, and then the students designed a national slavery memorial in Washington, D.C. as an experiment. The second semester, Mabel Wilson from Columbia worked with Professor Carver from our faculty, and we worked on this question of plantation economics. And then the students worked on a provisioning plantation on Long Island that was an actual plantation here in the Northeast. And then in the third semester, they worked on questions of cohorts of forced labor in Houston, which is a huge center of modern slavery problems in the United States, and particularly in the building industry. And then the students working with Caples Jefferson, a couple of Yale grads who have a firm in New York, they did a studio on a victim services center. And there's too much student work to show you here, but these are some examples of the kinds of work that the students did in the first semester. On the left is a kind of decision-making flowchart that an architect could use to decide whether there was a problem in the materials they were choosing. In the middle column is a sourcing strategy that one of our teams did, and then the plantation team was looking at this whole question of space and labor systems and did a series of diagrams that they used to support the students subsequently. There's way too much work to show you here, but it was a really interesting series of investigations that really began to demonstrate to Lou and to me that this problem that we're working on is multidimensional, that it includes characteristics of all sorts of things, that some of which we work on here in the School of Architecture, and in other ways we need a lot of help. There are questions of legal policy, there's supply chain management, there's technology, there's a political strategy, lots and lots of, it's a very complex and multidimensional problem, and you'll hear a little bit about a lot of that. And one of the ways that we framed the problem was with this diagram that I built to try to explain to our students what the kind of dynamics of this labor situation is as we make decisions as architects. And so Lou, my colleague and my mentor, is a trial attorney, and so he told me I needed to bring a prop. So, Deborah, I stole this from your office about 15 minutes ago. I hope that's okay. So this is Rudolph Hall right here. And when Charlie Gwathmey was designing the renovation and the addition to Rudolph Hall and the Loria addition, he made this sketch on the left. And when Lou and I were teaching the first iteration of the class, I called him one day and I said, we're going to do a talk on the supply chain. I don't want you to think about it. I want you to just pick the worst material you can think of that would be problematic for an architect. And he said, oh, that's easy, it's zinc. And I thought, great, I'm sitting in a building that's encased, I'm sitting next to a building that is completely enclosed in architectural zinc, because that's the material that Charlie chose for Loria. So what we were really interested in was unpacking this question of how an architect can make a decision at the very beginning of the process that through a series of relationships and obligations and exchanges of risk and money ultimately results in essentially the enslavement of a person. In this case, it's a child in a Peruvian zinc oxide mine. And you can see here, this chart is obviously too small to read, which was kind of the point that we were making to the students, which is you were at the headwaters of this enormously complex decision-making matrix. And we need to understand this thing better so we can do a better job not exacerbating this problem. And so that's really the whole idea of this discussion that we're going to have over the next day and a half about how things are going to work. So I want to give you just an idea of how we're going to structure the next day and a half, and then Lou's going to take some time to set some context here. This is a day and a half exercise. For the first part of today, we're just going to set context. We're just going to give you enough background so you can understand the various dimensions of the problem. Some of these discussions will be political, others will be technical. We're going to take some time and look at other transformational movements that have occurred in the building industry, try to take some lessons from sustainability. Then this afternoon, we're going to focus on methodological strategies, different methods that people who have worked on this problem have attempted to try to solve it. And then tonight, we'll have a keynote from my good friend and colleague, Billy Faircloth, formerly of Kieran Timberlake and now at Cornell, who will give a keynote address on this topic. And then tomorrow, we're going to break into work groups so you can take the things that you have learned and generate some ideas. So the idea is to come out of the day at the end, by lunchtime tomorrow, with some tangible, actionable ideas that we can take along these various routes. So I'm going to do my best to kind of keep us on time, which means, Lou, you get exactly 15 minutes. And ready? Let's go.
All right. Well, welcome everybody to me going backwards, evidently. Okay. So, as Phil mentioned, a lot of what we're working on, but now wanting to take out kind of into the world, are things that we've learned through this multidisciplinary class. Basically, workshopping with the students, whether it's from social work, whether it's from architecture, whether it's from law, policy, even museum studies, folks who are able to come together and really try to push this into new directions. And so that kind of very iterative process, a lot of design thinking, a lot of cross-disciplinary thinking. But I think that one of the things that we realize is that, especially for our architects, but even for our folks who think about law and government, we have to go back to the beginning, as it were. And luckily, that beginning is one person. the kind of the first architect, or one of the folks who we can say is one of the first architects, but also one of the people who thought of the entire democratic experiment in the United States. And of course, that means not just that we end up having slavery embedded in the important buildings of the United States, the vernacular of a democratic building, the way that Jefferson was trying to bring in kind of anti-monarchical. Not only do you have it in the actual buildings, and there are bricks with the imprints of child slave hands all over the South on the back part of the bricks, it's not facing the street. But that idea that both the architectural profession, the United States government, our democratic experiment also has that imprint of slavery. And it's not to take away from the glorious parts of Jefferson or the glorious parts of the American experiment, but to be able to understand that. So that's kind of why we start with things like Monticello, with UVA, et cetera. I think this is especially relevant this week. This is the 160th anniversary of this picture being taken earlier this week. This is in the wreckage of Richmond after the American Army had actually entered and was busy chasing the Confederate Army out to the west. Lee's surrender 2 days ago, 160 years ago, takes us into a place where, for the first time in the United States, slavery is illegal. And I think that one of the things that's important when we're thinking about the built environment is this picture. We've got technology such as it was in the South. We've also got the people who themselves marched for their own freedom, black troops from the North, standing on the wreckage of the Confederacy, not just metaphorically, but actually standing on the wreckage. But the reason that I wanted to start the conference with this image is what you see past the wreckage of that locomotive. You see that building up there? Keep an eye on that building. And keep an eye, as you do that, on Thomas Jefferson and our assumptions about what American architecture actually is. Because, of course, Jefferson, as he was trying to come up with something that would basically refute the monarchies that they were overthrowing, looked all the way back into the republics of the antiquity and really tried to mimic that. This is the State House in Virginia. It looks so much littler now because of all the big buildings that are around it, but it is a Roman temple. In fact, it is that Roman temple that the Maison Carrée, which Jefferson saw when he was in France during his European sojourns on behalf of the United States as our first overseas diplomat. This is it a while before, and then you start to see Jefferson as an architect, not Jefferson as a diplomat, not Jefferson as the architect of the American experiment, but actually Jefferson as an architect, the work that he's doing in bringing this in. Not surprisingly, he is basing that Republican ideal on two republics, Greece and Rome, which are in fact slave states. And so as a result, the Confederacy basically posits itself as the inheritors of those traditions and the inheritors then through Jefferson of the architectural tradition. Now, why is this important? One of the reasons why it's important is I think it goes to that ideal that we look at. We look at a building like this and we say, I understand what it's trying to do. We're basically trying to say that we're the new Athens. We're trying to send signals as to what this building represents to everyone. We're not necessarily trying to look at the fact that Jefferson made most of his money off of the nails that his child slaves made in his little nail factory, which populate pretty much the entire mid-Atlantic. Anything built in wood has Jefferson's nails. He was a bad farmer, but he was a very good materials supplier. And so that idea, when we're starting to look at materials here, again, embedded into the very foundation of the Republic. Why is this important now? Part of why that's important now is that in throwing off those chains and getting the 13th Amendment and ending chattel slavery in the United States. The way that it's constructed basically says that it shall not exist going forward. It doesn't say it's over. It says it shall not exist going forward. And so, in the modern era, what we end up talking about is modern slavery, or we call it human trafficking, or we call it forced labor. But we're talking about the things that are necessary to deliver on that promise when people are saying, this shall not happen anymore in the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. That becomes part of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948 with the creation of the United Nations. And at the end of the day, you're just talking about different words for compelled service. So I am the law professor who is coming in telling you that these legal words both have meaning and don't have meaning because they are umbrella terms. And so I'm violating some of the things that we're supposed to do as law professor. Really what we're talking about is a situation in which people are obtaining or maintaining the services of another person, labor or services. And that could be sexual services, which a lot of people pay a lot of attention to as far as human trafficking is concerned. That can be labor as well. And it doesn't have to be kidnapping. It doesn't have to be against their will to begin with. It can be that they get stuck. It could be that that person was a drywall guy back home, and suddenly now he's on a crew and he can't leave here in the United States because of threats to turn him over to the immigration service or what have you. At that point, that person is considered a victim of modern slavery, even if they voluntarily engaged in it, which makes it a little bit trickier as we start to ask you to help us come up with ways to intervene. Globally, we're talking about 28 million people in forced labor around the world. Just in the G20, that represents almost $500 billion worth of inputs. So it's not simply that people are being moved, it's the goods that people are making, the materials, just like Jefferson's nails, going all over Northern Virginia, Southern Maryland, and the District of Columbia. Most notably, by the way, in the Octagon, which is part of the AIA complex in Washington, D.C., made by enslaved people, made with those slave-made inputs, and standing proudly wrapped by the AIA headquarters. As I mentioned, once the UN gets involved, we end up having not just the United States saying that there's a 13th Amendment that says that you can't enslave people, but the Universal Declaration of Rights. And so there are things, if you are a firm that is working in the international arena, and if you are a firm that's totally domestic, you are in the international arena because you are almost unable to build anything without those inputs from overseas. You are looking at a global, not just an American infrastructure. That means that there's legal exposure. And we'll post these slides so you don't have to this is the most text-heavy slide that I'll end up using. The main thing to take away from this, exactly. The main thing to take away from this is there is legal exposure. Whether or not that is criminal, whether that's civil, whether that's, you do not want that curtain wall that is supposed to be arriving on Tuesday to not arrive for another 6 months because it's held up at the port because somebody figures out that the glaze is coming from artisanal mines in the Congo where children are being lowered into pits to bring out that material, even though it goes to Germany to be assembled. So that idea of whether the exposure is criminal, whether the exposure is more days on as far as project delivery is concerned, that idea of this is your problem, even if we don't think of it as everyone's problem. We're going to talk over the next few hours about a number of the different theories of change and a number of the different ways in which people are confronting this. But I want to just highlight a couple of them. First of all, this idea of consumer things. If you think about the early 1800s, one of the ways that slavery was outlawed in the British Empire is because people started actually standing up and saying, we will not purchase sugar from Barbados, Jamaica, etc. And it actually had an impact. And as a result, you had people in Parliament whose money was flowing from those plantations started realizing that they were going to have to cut a deal and that they were going to have to move over to a free labor situation. We see that today, and we'll be talking a little bit about that as far as whether it's supply chain transparency efforts or consumer efforts in the United States and around the world. There's also this notion of compliance. As I mentioned, your stuff getting stopped at the border or not allowed in at all. And what we've seen just in the last few weeks is that the folks over at Customs and Border Protection are not asleep at the switch and have not been doged at this point. But we see that with a recent withhold release order against salt coming in from South Korea. And we're hoping, especially with one of the alums from the trafficking office and the Department of Labor office that handles this, has just gone over to CBP in the last week or so. And we're hoping that that's a good sign as far as this kind of work being continued. But it's not just supplier misconduct. It's things that you can do. And we'll hear about that throughout the day. I just wanted to front them this idea of things that you can do, not just in your design, being aware of zinc or not, but also as you're speccing a project, as you're putting together the contracts. If you are a owner's rep insisting on these things, you have the power to do this. And I think that that's one of the things that we very much saw in the class and otherwise, is that people have agency. Architects at times have kind of given that agency over to the folks on the construction companies over the last 50 years. But this, I think, is a time for leadership and a time to claim that agency that architects necessarily have. But this is not just theories. It's not $468 billion. It's not numbers around the world. It's people. The woman that you see here with her child being reunited at SeaTac Airport after 3 years of working in a garment factory in the United States in American Samoa, that's a picture of them locked in. It wasn't really in 87. Their trafficker didn't know how to set his camera thing on that. But that is, you can kind of see over there, there's a guard that actually has a club. He's not clubbing the girls right then, but was a little bit later that night. And 3 years after being liberated from that garment factory, average weight upon the FBI showing up and getting them out was 78 pounds of the women in that garment factory. 3 years later, being able to reunite with her family because of the T visa, which is one of the things that's available to trafficking victims in the United States. The people from that garment factory are now business owners. The children have gone to college. People are getting law degrees. People are out there working in every sector, and they are becoming experts. And we're going to talk today about survivor expertise. How do we harness those people? Not simply looking at them as, oh my God, we should go rescue those people who are locked in, but rather we should be there for those moments of joy with them. And we should be there as they join us in the fight against human trafficking. So, what does that mean for us? Well, part of it is that we have to look at our own particular sets of skills. Everyone has a role to play in this. If somebody is a dentist, they can volunteer with the folks who are doing victim services, because somebody's been locked in a garment factory for 3 years, they probably have not had access to dental, gynecological, etc. services. Everyone can bring what they have. And so what I'm going to suggest is that everybody here has a very special set of skills, and that is, I'm an architect. So when somebody on the plane says, oh my God, can anyone help? Raise your hand and say, it's okay, I'm an architect. Thanks, everybody. And so now if we could ask David Blight, who taught me to quote Frederick Douglass in every one of my speeches, if we could ask Dr. Blight to come up. And I think the podium will be yours, David.
Yeah, just let me say, we're not going to spend time reading people's files.
Good.
You need to grab a copy of everybody's files.
Oh, good. Okay. Thank you, Phil and Lou. Thank you all for coming today. I had the special privilege in this teaching project of being, in essence, the sole historian, so I could come over here and say anything I wanted. could just get away with it. Except Griffin, you were in it one year, and I knew I was, being monitored. Seriously, this has been an exciting project for the Gilder Lehrman Center. I direct the center here at Yale, those of you new to Yale, for the study of slavery and abolition. We've been around since 1998. We do all kinds of historical projects, but we also have one eye institutionally on the present and on legacies, and this was something that was both new and exciting. I learned so much about how I won't say I learned that much about architecture, because I still don't know that much, but I learned how architects think. And one quick anecdote, the first day we met to sort of sketch out the course in one of the small rooms up here, Phil got a piece of chalk on a blackboard and started making that design that he just showed you. And by the time we ended, the whole course had been designed on a blackboard. I had never experienced that. I love chalk and blackboards, but I've never seen an architect at work on one. Amazing. To cut to the chase, I want to take us back to the origins of Yale University and its oldest building. Now, about 3.5 years ago, the president of Yale asked me, it was in September, God, is it 4 years now? The president of Yale, Peter Salovey, asked me one day in September 2020 if I would lead the research, write up a project on the history of Yale and slavery. Now, I didn't know much about Yale and slavery at that point, but I knew it was a long and deep history, an institution over 320 years old. And I was praying that phone call wasn't happening, because I wasn't intending to do that. But I said yes, and our center, and my associate director, Michelle Zaks, and several other people worked very hard on this for 3 years, and we produced this book, Yale and Slavery, A History. Now, it's many things, but it's essentially the story of how enslaved people were first part of building Yale, how slave-related commerce was so important to Connecticut in the 18th century. Approximately 50% of all ships and all merchant trade out of New Haven Harbor, and it's the same or even higher in many other New England ports, went directly to the West Indies and to the sugar complex of the West Indies throughout most of the 18th century. Many donors to Yale who helped create it were either slave owners or slave traders. Many of the leaders of Yale, in fact, the first 5, 6 presidents of Yale were themselves slaveholders. It was common for New England divines, New England clergy, and all Yale presidents were clergymen until modern times. It was common for them to own from 1 to 20 enslaved people, usually Africans or African Americans, sometimes Native Americans. But to cut to the chase, because I think I only have 10 minutes or so, the oldest building on this campus is called Connecticut Hall. You see it here. It was constructed between about 1850 and 53, I guess, before they completely finished it. It is the oldest brick building in Connecticut, national landmark building, oldest building on this campus, historic landmark by any measure. It has 222 windows. I actually went there one day and counted them. I mean, this research became that kind of research. And it was in part possible because of the then president, actually the first president of Yale, Thomas Clapp, the first one to be designated as president, kept, like Jefferson, meticulous records, especially of the materials and the labor. Now, I hope I'm doing this right. Down. Oh, I go down. Oh. Down. Oh, the middle down. No? I'm sorry. Up. Well, no. I'm on somebody else's, oh dear. Well, I'll go back to Connecticut Hall if I
Trevor,
can.
you reset for us? Thanks.
All right. So I'll use the middle button here, huh? Should have rehearsed.
Keep talking.
Yeah, okay. Well, in the building of Connecticut Hall, we found meticulous records of the labor, but we also discovered. Okay. Woo. There we are.
You're catching all that.
Bing. Yeah, just go about 3 back, I think. 3 or 4. Perfect. Well, rather, there you are. Or is there a map right after this?
Yeah, two more.
2 more. Okay. I'm sorry. Can we go back? Thank you, sir. Anyway, in the earliest map ever drawn, no, that's not it. There it is. There it is. In the earliest map, the James Wadsworth map, he was an 8. Right here. I just go down. Right. Thank you. Takes a law professor and an ambassador to tell a historian how to work the clicker. I know. The earliest map ever made of New Haven and of what became the Yale campus was by an 18-year-old Yale student named James Wadsworth. It's this extraordinary map of the so-called 9 squares of New Haven, and Yale, what became Yale College and Yale University, was right in the center of this. But up in the upper left-hand corner, great. On this original map, we looked closely and we saw it says Jethro Black Man Farmer in that upper left corner. If you're at all familiar with the Yale campus, it's almost exactly or just behind where the Yale Law School is now, at the corner of York and Grove Streets. That corner was land owned by one Jethro Luke, owned it. He was born somewhere around 1700. We're not sure if born in Africa or here. He was enslaved in he was enslaved in the early 1700s. He was owned by Mary Pierpont, who was also the mother-in-law of Jonathan Edwards, the wife of James Pierpont, one of the founders. He's actually the founding minister of the original church on the Green. Jethro Luke, his first wife, Ruth, and his wife were manumitted by Mary Pierpont at her death in 1740. Ruth died. Jethro remarried a woman named Mindwell, and they lived and worked this little farm in that corner of what is now part of the Yale campus. It became known later, well into the 19th century, we found records of this, as Jethro's Corner. And we've yet to put up the plaque. There's a plaque planned. I don't know exactly where on that corner it's going to go, but I hope. A lot has come out of this project, but one of the things I hope is the renaming of that intersection of that corner as Jethro's Corner. But Jethro and his son Gad were part of the work team of 22 men who built Connecticut Hall over a period of 2 years. It is about a 10-minute walk from that corner across the campus to where Connecticut Hall was being built. Every morning, 191 days of labor for Jethro and almost that many for his son. They walked that space. I actually timed it one day. It didn't take 10 minutes to walk that distance. They were part of a team that built the hall. And they essentially had the job, although they probably worked on the foundation. They may have even worked on the windows. But their job was primarily mixing the mortar for the bricks. It was their job to mix the lime, oyster shells, of which there were millions out on the harbor, and other products to make mortar for bricks. Now, Clapp was an interesting man, a smart man, not a highly reflective man when it came to anything related to slavery. There's no evidence anywhere in his voluminous papers, he was president 25 years of Yale, that he ever was in the least worried or concerned about enslavement, nor were most of his 18th century Yale colleagues. It was essentially an unthinking part of their surrounding environment. Clapp himself enslaved about 5 or 6 people over time. We have their names. We know who they were. Clapp, typical and appropriate for a Calvinist Puritan minister, censored all kinds of things at Yale, including Baptist tracts. They were not allowed in the library. He also prepared the first catalog of the Yale Library, which you can actually see over at the Beinecke. Clapp had an enormous impact on this place. But again, he kept detailed records. He enslaved Pompey, born, he says, about 1713. Phyllis, born about 1717. Tamar, recently born on December 18th, 1736. And so it goes in his records. Now, there was a certain hierarchy to the laborers. It's not completely clear how, that the white laborers did the more difficult labor by any means. But to some extent, they may have been, to some degree, segregated. But then he also records at great length what he calls teamwork. Teams of workers, where whites and blacks clearly were working together. You couldn't mount those windows. You couldn't put the beams in place without a whole team of people doing it. This was white and black labor. Then he lists the materials, which gets to the point of this conference, I suspect. Imagine these materials and where they all came from around the Atlantic. And this is only a partial list. Door locks, shingles, masonry of all kinds, hay, thousands of bricks, kilns. They employed about 4 kilns in building it. Lime, stones, carts for hauling, long beams, joiners, pine boards, nails, oil, white lead, 41 squares of glass for round windows. Those are the ones on the dormers. And, quote, various tools. Clapp was meticulous in his records about humans and about the material, which is perhaps the central theme of this conference. First stone was laid in 1715. The construction went on, as I said, for approximately 2 years. They had to carry timbers from the harbor day in, day out. The carts were going back and forth, and the harbor was a little closer then. But they built the thing, and in the records, yes, Clapp again details the materials, but he particularly detailed the labor. Well, the labor here, digging of the cellar, et cetera, loads of stone, and so on and so on. And then the number of days that his workers worked. And no one had ever seen, seen maybe, but published in any way these records. President's Negro, that's Clapp's own. We know his name now, 83 days of work. Mr. McNeil's Negro worked 92 and 3/4 days. He would record half days, quarter days. Mr. Noyes, he was a minister Negro, 177 3/4 days. Jethro and Gad, 191 and a half days, etc. Now, and this is even great. We finally dug around, and I have to give great credit here to my research team. We had eventually about 4 people working full-time in the Beinecke and the Sterling records, trying to find the names of these people, and we did. Mingo, George, Jack, Dick, Jethro and Gad, Luke were the only ones with a last name. Now, I would just conclude this by simply saying this beautiful building, which you should go over and see, portions of which are original material. The stairways inside, creaky as they are, I believe are original. It once housed the philosophy department, I think until just 2 years ago. They're moving another department.
Chaplain's office.
The chaplain's office is moving in there. We used to hold faculty meetings, the Yale faculty meetings on the second floor, typical of a congregational church architecture. The sanctuary, if you will, was on the second floor. And for 2 years, while they were remodeling the Hall of Graduate Studies, the history department held all of its department meetings in there. My memories of that room are, unfortunately, history department meetings, tenure decisions and all that, you know. And that was before I did all this research. God, I wish I'd known what I know now about that room. I probably would have been lecturing my colleagues to their great disdain. But here's the thing. It's never been recognized for how it was built. My fond dream, one of my fond dreams that came out of this project, and I've expressed this, I even wrote it in the book, and it's possible it could still happen. Yale holds its glorious commencements, and they are spectacular events. And they do it pretty quickly, to be honest, in that quad. It's the freshman old campus. Connecticut Hall is right at one end of it. Everybody marches in by or around Connecticut Hall on that day. The students, the deans, everybody. But there's no marker on that building. There's a Nathan Hale statue. There are some plaques in the building about its history, but nothing of this story of how it was built. So I've imagined, and before Peter Salovey left office, I met with him. He said, yeah, what an idea. Why not commissioning student artists to imagine a gigantic mural that would be unfurled down the side of Connecticut Hall? I guess maybe showing Jethro and Gad at a brick kiln or something like that at the key moment of a Yale commencement. No one would ever forget that. They'll forget the speeches. They'll forget the crazy stuff they had on the top of their cap. But they would not forget that. And it would allow a Yale president, 5 minutes to tell this story that I've told him, 10 or 15. Now, the last point. Account books, turns out, I've learned this from my research on Frederick Douglass and others, is account books tell a narrative. Account books are a story. Even our, back when we used to keep checkbooks, they're a story. They can tell a story both utterly banal and richly revealing of the economic, moral, and social worlds from which they emerge. They can record both simple, inert facts and large truths. Thomas Clapp left a story of labor and enslavement, as well as an architectural and construction history that has been hidden in plain sight in the Yale archives for more than 2.5 centuries. At every magnificent Yale commencement ceremony, students and their residential college heads and deans march all around that building with banners and flags. And then I go on to say, why not a new flag honoring Jethro Luke? Why not new banners about Mr. President's Negro and the like? And then the rolling sounds, perhaps, of ovations on commencement day, and it's an incredibly beautiful, loud event, will provide a truly new feeling in the spring air. Might we even imagine a posthumous honorary degree for the formerly enslaved Jethro Luke, who walked and labored on these very grounds? I hadn't really understood the material part of this history except for writing it until doing this course with you guys. The history of slavery at Yale is in the bricks, and it isn't just in that building. There are many, many, many other architectural landmarks on this campus. If not directly related to slave labor, They are directly related to Yale's story with slavery and its long effort to essentially suppress it. It should be said, though, that the reason we did this book and uncovered this story is because Yale's president and his team had the courage to do it. It was their idea. The faculty did not insist on it. He did. Thank you.
So having the courage to actually look, to recognize, and to insist on the truth, it's very popular now to call that transparency. And we talk about supply chain transparency. We talk about confronting these hidden histories and everything else. But the folks that are out there doing it, we're very lucky to have our next speaker who has very much led this fight, Sheila Ahluwalia from Transparentum.
Hey Lou, how do I advance the slides? I just go down, right? Okay. I'm not so good at things like that. Hi everyone, I'm Sheila Ahluwalia. I'm the Director of Policy and Advocacy at Transparentum. I'm so excited to be here today. Thank you so much for inviting me. Today I'm going to highlight the risks and opportunities in tackling forced labor in supply chains. It's going to be a high-level framing, as there's going to be a lot of speakers today who will get into the details. You can just think of this as me laying the foundation for some of the upcoming conversations we're going to have. While I didn't bring any object with me, I do want to tell a story. We heard a little bit about the story of Jethro. I want to tell you the story about a man who I'm going to call Syed. He's one of the workers that Transparentum investigators interviewed in late 2020 and early 2021. He worked in Mauritius. It wasn't until after he landed in Mauritius that Syed realized that his recruiter had lied to him. The agent had promised him a monthly salary of $470 to $580, but upon arrival at his factory in Mauritius, which was thousands of miles from his family in Bangladesh, Syed saw that his true wages would be a small fraction of the promised sum, and it was too late to turn back. The price of his new job in Mauritius, which included fees for passports, medical checks, and then mostly recruitment fees, amounted to $3,500. It was more than he could afford with savings alone. He borrowed nearly $1,200 in a deal involving a small shop that he owned. The lender would occupy the store rent-free until Syed repaid the loan. He also gave up $700 in rental income during the 2 years that it took him to pay off his debt. Syed signed a 3-year contract with the factory. The document was written in English, and it was explained to him, but still he said the deal was not totally clear. He said, "I did not understand the contract paper since it was my first time abroad." When he complained to a factory manager that his salary was less than what the agent had promised, they simply referred him to the salary that was in the contract he had signed. According to Syed, factory management said, "Didn't you see this before coming here? Now, if you don't want to stay, pay for your flight and leave." Syed stayed, but he was unable to save any money until he paid off his debt. He said, "This small salary is not enough. I have a family. I have a wife and children. I have to pay for their education. I didn't make any money in 2019 and 2020. But even that wasn't the worst of life at the factory, according to Syed. He said, "Our number one problem is the food. The condition of food at this factory is so poor that it is beyond imagination. Despite going hungry and becoming physically weak due to inedible food, he found that he had no recourse. He said, "There's no one to talk to. There's no representative whom we can speak to." According to Syed, workers who complained about the food were sent home. Faced with the risk of deportation, most simply endured the situation. He said if anyone tries to complain about the food, the owner himself would say, either eat or go back to Bangladesh, go back to India. Even apart from the food complaints, being sent home was a constant danger at the factory. Syed said management would send workers home for production mistakes, falling ill, or trying to form a union. He said they do send workers home for small reasons too. As far as I understand, they do it so that no worker can do this in the future. Workers would also be sent home for speaking with auditors, he said. If I say something today, the company will hand me the ticket tomorrow. Management conceal things from auditors in other ways too. When workers brought personal fans to improve the inadequate ventilation in their dorm rooms, factory managers made sure that they were hidden when auditors inspected the bedrooms, he said. After several years with the company, he said he regretted coming and was headed home. He said, the food is so bad, I would have never come. I would rather starve in Bangladesh. So thanks for listening to his story. This is an illustration of what vulnerable workers face in supply chains. And yes, okay. So this first data point is, I think, the same one that Lou shared, although his slide was better. This is from the 2021 Global Estimates of Modern Slavery that say that there's 27.6 million people in forced labor in supply chains. And then in a 2024 ILO report, forced labor in private economies generated $236 billion in illegal profits annually. And this is an increase of 37% 10 years ago. But before I get into the risks and opportunities, I just want to highlight a few issues. The first are challenges within deep supply chains. So the deeper that one goes, the worse the abuse is. There is definitely forced labor in tier 1 establishments, but it's more common in tier 2, tier 3, and beyond, where companies often claim that they lack visibility. Construction supply chains also span multiple industries, which we already heard a little bit about. There's bricks, there's textiles, there's metal, there's timber, there's cement, there's mining, and each of these materials have their own distinct risks. And subcontracting is also an issue, regardless of whether it's authorized or unauthorized. I also feel compelled to talk about recruitment, which is an issue that we heard in Syed's story. So forced labor often starts with exploitative recruitment practices, and this could be domestic or international. It can be classic debt bondage, when a worker gets a loan from their employer, and then has to work in order to pay off their debts. But this can also manifest as unethical international labor recruitment, which is where workers often take on debt for recruitment fees, then they arrive to learn that they were deceived, finding low wages and worse conditions. This was precisely Syed's story, and it's one that we see around the world. While we generally think of this as a problem in migrant communities, whether it's international migrants or also domestic migrants, this also happens when workers are not migrating at all. Transfrentum did some research a couple years ago about local Indonesian workers in garment factories, and even they had to pay fees for local jobs. They had to for these 3-year contracts, so that they were in the cycle of constantly having to pay more fees. And then forced labor, of course, is not just in how the materials are made, but it's also in the services themselves. So the Gulf is kind of an easy place to look at this. You have migrant workers in major construction projects, including World Cup infrastructure. They face systemic forced labor issues. We've seen some American universities be implicated in this as well in the Gulf. We've all read about U.S. child labor in construction. There's recent reports that migrant workers face very dangerous jobs in construction, sometimes leading to death, and some of this is certainly forced labor. And just last week, there was a BHRC report, and that stands for Business, Human Rights, and Resource Center. They said that construction and engineering was the sector with the second highest incidence of migrant labor abuse. There's also some broader service sector exploitation that's involved in this. So for instance, you can have subcontracted cleaning services for factories, and those cleaning services can exploit vulnerable workers. We've seen this in one of our investigations. And then in some mining areas, forced prostitution could be a problem. I'm going to talk about risks and opportunities. This first slide is the code of conduct of a large construction company. You can see it's very slim. I circle the area where forced labor is included. So the good news is that many multinational companies now realize that forced labor is a problem, and this awareness is growing. But the bad news, of course, is that there's often a really big gulf between policy and practice. And then the key challenge is that once things are worked out on paper, how do we ensure that anti-forced labor measures are implemented? This next slide is about supply chain transparency. So this is a screenshot from Patagonia, which is considered one of the leaders in supply chain transparency for a private company. This is their website showing some of their suppliers. So there's also been a lot of progress on this. More and more companies are publishing supplier lists, and there's platforms like Open Supply Hub, which helps trace things as well. And there's also some improvements in technology. I'm more familiar with the ones about cotton that help trace some raw materials. But the bigger challenge is that a lot of this transparency is still limited to tier 1, but forced labor often happens deeper in the chain. We need full supply chain mapping. We need it down to the raw materials. We need it across subcontractors, and we also need to be looking at recruitment chains, including looking at the recruitment agents who are the first kind of point of contact with the workers. Transparency is so crucial for governments, for civil society organizations, for investors, and of course for workers themselves to be able to scrutinize practices effectively. And they're important for companies themselves, so the companies are able to know what's actually happening in their supply chain. I want to talk a little bit about legislation. I'm not going to get into this too much because I know others are going to be talking about it. This is a screenshot from Customs and Border Protection. It shows a list of the withhold release orders, and if anyone is following this, you'll see I kind of was very passive-aggressive in the WRO that I chose to highlight. So there's been a lot of excitement about forced labor import bans and also mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence legislation, which I'll just call due diligence legislation. I think that import bans and forced labor is a really exciting and promising tool when it's enforced, when it's used with remediation on top of mind, and also when the implementation process addresses second-order issues. So for instance, if a factory does have to close down because of it, what are you going to do with these newly employed workers? Everyone's also been very excited about this kind of like second wave of legislation, due diligence legislation, which is kind of an improvement of this transparency legislation that we saw maybe 10 years ago. The problem, of course, is enforcement. Some import bans that we've seen are not enforced at all, or they're inconsistently applied. And then for due diligence legislation, we've just been seeing all this backsliding. So in the EU, we have the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, which is now being opened up, watered down for this omnibus proposal. And then just yesterday, we learned that the German Supply Chain Act, I think, is abolished. There will be something else that will be in its place as kind of its obligations under the EU, but it will certainly be watered down, and also implementation of that's going to be delayed. Then to move to audits and certifications. Certifications often fail. We've known for a long time that there is a problem with these ethical certification schemes. These are schemes that give kind of a stamp of approval to a work site or to a supply chain. So in 2012, there was the Ali Enterprise fire where 300 workers were killed, and that happened in a certified factory. So you'd hope, okay, we learned a lesson, we'll fix this. But then Rana Plaza happened the year afterwards, and 2 of the factories in Rana Plaza were certified. Of all of the work sites where Transparentum has uncovered labor abuses, 2/3 of them were certified by an organization that purportedly assessed those same issues. And there's problems with audits. So social audits either are enforcing these certification schemes, or they're used separately by suppliers or brands to show compliance. They're often superficial, they can be easily manipulated, they can fail to detect real issues. A misleading audit can actually hide problems instead of exposing them. This slide is a report that we put out a few years ago. It's great, everyone should read it. There's a lot of scholarship about there on ways to improve certifications and audits. Some of those are in here. I'm not going to get into that now, but I'm happy to talk about that later. I know there's a lot of people in the audience who could also speak well to it. But I do want to say that companies that are using audits to show investors and governments that there are no problems should disclose them at minimum to those investors and governments, but ideally in redacted public versions, because transparency is key. Public procurement is really important. Governments are the world's biggest buyers, and a number of them have prohibitions on purchasing goods with forced labor, with trafficking in persons, with modern slavery. This is a slide of a foreign acquisition regulation of the US government, the section on trafficking in persons. Something that's pretty exciting is that there's a bill going on right now through the California legislature that, if passed, will make anti-trafficking requirements for California public procurement. If governments robustly enforce these rules, it's a game changer. But they need to ensure that they're not purchasing goods made with forced labor. They need to conduct rigorous due diligence, and they need to monitor supply chains across a range of products. And I was just speaking with someone today about how hard this is, but it's so important. Collective bargaining. After decades of decline, labor organizing is growing in the US. We're seeing it grow around the world. And of course, there has been setbacks. And we see in the federal government, there's some setbacks among federal unions by the Trump administration. But whenever I speak about forced labor, I have to talk about collective bargaining, because you can't have any real progress on forced labor without legitimate worker participation and organization that is free from retaliation. Oops, that's my exciting last slide. Okay. Worker-driven social responsibility. These worker-driven initiatives are really exciting. The Coalition of Immokalee Workers and their Fair Food Program is the best known and most powerful one, and I think that we have someone here from that organization, which is very exciting. The International Accord is another well-known one. It used to be the Bangladesh Accord. These initiatives provide a way, generally speaking, I know I see the flashing almost done, for vulnerable workers to protect and enforce their rights, and we're seeing more and more of these. We aren't seeing enough. A little bit of criticism: these programs shouldn't replace unions. They shouldn't let governments off the hook. They're hard to replicate, but all the criticism that I hear is very muted and, under the umbrella of like, wow, these are great. There needs to be more and more of them. And now for my last slide, so my daughter and I made this in ChatGPT. We're in a moment of tremendous political, economic, and diplomatic instability right now. I'm talking, of course, about the actions of the Trump administration, also the anti-ESG backlash in the US, the backtracking of legislation in the EU, and then, of course, growing anti-migrant sentiment across the world. I think that there's three key shifts to watch. The first is trade patterns, where production happens is changing. The second is diplomatic alliances, and I think this is why we have been seeing some action out of CBP lately. Some alliances promote forced labor enforcement, while others excuse it, and these alliances are shifting. And there's also unlikely coalitions, so there's a lot of new and unlikely alliances that are forming, including among labor rights groups and business. So my final takeaway is that with chaos comes opportunity, and over the next day and a half, I hope that we can work together and identify what some of those opportunities are and how we can act on them. Thank you.
So in the second part of the morning, where we're setting context, we're going to turn our attention to some of the specifics of these questions that are become apparent in the building supply chain, in the architecture, engineering, construction, and operations part of the process. So there'll be three speakers in this second piece. My colleague Jordan Carver, who worked on a project that I worked on a little bit several years ago called Who Builds Your Architecture, that examined questions of construction worker, labor, and flow. Then Lou's colleague Bridget Carr from Michigan Law is going to talk about some of her work in her laboratory there in Ann Arbor. And then we'll finish up with a short talk from Jacob Rydell, who's currently at Harvard GSD and is also a Yale grad, who's going to focus on project delivery systems and contractor agency. So what we're going to try to do in the next three discussions is focus the conversation into questions that are refracted specifically through the building industry. And then once these three talks have completed, we'll gather around the table and Lou and I will facilitate a sort of question and answer session. So we ready to go? Jordan, you're up.
Okay. Thanks, Lou, and thanks, Phil, for the introduction. and for organizing. Thank you all for being here. So I'm tasked this morning with introducing issues pertaining to the job site. And much of this thinking that I've been doing about it relates to work I've done with Who Builds Your Architecture, as Phil noted. But I'll probably also reference a lot of the work being done by other people in the room. So thank you for all your expertise, and it'll come in here, and then I'll be presenting a little bit in the afternoon as well. So you might see some of it. So apologies if I don't get it quite right. So Who Builds Your Architecture is an advocacy group that asks, how can architects better understand connections between the design of buildings and the workers who ultimately construct them? The group consists of myself, Mabel Wilson, Kadambari Bachi, and Lindsay Wickstrom, and we are currently working on an update to our 2006 field guide, which was a kind of professional practices book inserting a lot of these questions into kind of pedagogical frameworks. And so when I say we, I'll sometimes mean the people here in this room, but also the we as in Who Built Your Architecture, because it's been a real collective effort in trying to uncover some of this research. So I want to start with this chart depicting, perhaps in too simplistic terms, the ways in which contractual obligations flow around the job site to highlight how questions of labor and site conditions are positioned under the purview of the contractor. I'll come back to it again this afternoon. But these contractual relations and limitations on architectural agency concerning the job site, much less construction means and methods, require us as architects to think in new and different ways about affecting labor policies on the site and throughout the supply chain. Much of my thinking stems from research located in the Gulf region. While these sites have particular relations to labor and very specific issues pertaining to migration and migration restrictions, much of the work is applicable to thinking about job sites in the United States and many other locations around the world. That said, we have been wary of using abstractions and abstract language to discuss issues of labor, fearing that it reduces the attention from actual workers on site, whether that is the job site, the production site, or sites of extraction. Who Builds Your Architecture has worked with and relied on human rights organizations and other related government and non-government institutions in conjunction with on-site field research. Some human rights and anti-trafficking activists call contemporary labor exploitation modern-day slavery. Others use forced labor or unfree labor. The definition means slightly different things in different contexts, but in thinking about labor on site, its unfree or forced form encompasses a few related criteria that we've been investigating. The first is debt. Often workers incur debt in their initial training to become workers. They also incur debt for travel and the right to work away from their home countries. This can include debt from visas, air travel, even work, or even food and housing. The second condition is lack of mobility. Often visas and passports are confiscated and held by employers. Workers are then beholden to their employer regardless of the work or housing conditions. And they can get neither new jobs nor can they return home. Often this condition is linked, again, to debt repayment and other forms of peonage. This can even include confinement into worker camps and job sites. And then once the workers are on site, the issues of fairness include site safety, whether or not they have proper training and safety equipment, proper breaks and access to bathrooms, rest areas, and water. Wage fairness and distribution, whether or not the workers are getting the wages they are promised, and if they are receiving it themselves. And housing conditions, whether or not workers are provided adequate housing in terms of privacy, food, communication, leisure, cleanliness, laundry, etc. And as you can see, there are many ways in which on-site construction labor can be deemed fair, enforced, or otherwise exploitative. And as we shift us as a group into thinking about the United States a little bit more closely, some of these issues are lessened, but all are still present. More recently, we are concerned with the rights of migrants on job sites and whether or not employers and clients can and are willing to protect workers from ICE and other immigration enforcement. For reference, as of 2021, 63% of New York City's construction laborers are immigrants and around 41% are estimated to be undocumented. This makes construction the sector with the highest rate of migrant employment and the primary target for immigration enforcement. The Urban Institute has reported that mass deportations would worsen the already existing housing crisis especially in Texas and California. Simply stating, migrants are vital for housing markets and the economy. And just recently, I'm sure many of you have seen this, the New York Times ran an analysis on what tariffs and deportations might mean for one Phoenix area home, noting that the administration's policies would lead to a 16% increase in labor and 31% increase in materials, both of which, of course, would have dramatic effects on the entire design and construction industry. From poor housing and so-called labor camps to substandard wages to unfair recruiting conditions to guest workers with no access to citizenship rights, we have worked with several organizations to document the dark side of architectural sites. Understanding that our expertise, such as it is not necessarily doing human rights fieldwork, but in trying to address the issue from the position as educators and practitioners, it has been important to form collaborative models of work, like this conference would be one of those models, where we can help develop, translate, and broadcast fieldwork and reporting into different spaces. To do this work, one of our goals is to produce drawings and other standard architectural representations that clearly show how architects and workers are connected. Across the globe, a design construction network for transnational projects can be assimilated into drawings and large network mappings to show how independent the various design and construction fields are. A construction site is rendered as a locus point for the accumulation of knowledge, material, and labor. In the middle, the project site, with architects and migrants placed at either ends of an axis. In between are dispersed production sites across vast distances throughout a truly global network. The left side begins with the architect's office, and at the center is a site, and to the right, workers. In between are sites of material extraction and production, subcontracting, transportation, and housing. From the many different directions, architects, building materials, and migrants arrive at a common site where their only connection is often mediated by drawing sets, material specs, and the possibility of chance encounter. Realizing the opportunity to interact with on-site workers is limited at best, this calls into question the role of drawing as a communicative device. Even then, only a limited group of workers have access to architectural drawings, often only foremen or management. But it does present an opportunity to think about how drawing conventions relate to craft, method, skill, and other forms of work. So on the left side, rendered here, of this network is a highly developed management system using BIM software and kind of highly technical means of production that tends to run fairly efficiently, at least most of the time. Minute changes in coordination across this global network are relatively easy. For example, a change in location of a single bolt in a truss can be made quickly and across the entire system. However, on the right side, difficulties faced by migrant workers at various points remain highly localized. Moreover, to some participants in the same network, i.e. architects, often in another country, they also remain largely invisible. Or, as often pointed out, the labor processes of construction, including migration and worksite conditions, are often considered outside or downstream of the process of design, if they are considered at all. One of our researchers, Laura Dixit, spent years traveling and doing ethnographic research in Nepal. She tracked internal migration and saw young men traveling from small villages to urban centers to learn basic construction techniques like pouring concrete. Here they would meet brokers and recruiters working in Gulf countries, sign labor contracts, and make arrangements for multi-year foreign-based work. Once arriving in the receiving country, their passports and other immigration papers would often be confiscated. They would be transferred to work camps, often far outside urban centers and away from job sites, where they would work long hours, 6 or more days a week. For those able to fulfill their contracts, repay their broker debt, and send some money home, they would often find themselves enrolling in the process all over again. And for those that didn't, they would often be trapped in a cycle of labor peonage, working off debt, and shuffled between labor brokers and construction managers. What is clear is the labor market for construction work lacks any sort of central governing structure or standardization. There are some regulations, like the International Labor Organization, but these regulations require ratification and adherence. Often states are left to regulate both labor conditions and training as they see fit. While there are plenty of critiques to offer both governance and standardization, labor is one of the few sectors of the construction process that lacks any sort of broad-based governance if we think in terms of licensing and production standardization that kind of governs the professional aspects of the trade. In fact, one of the primary vehicles allowing architectural practice to span the globe is the development and acceptance of these universal standards, regulating design and construction disciplines and the many of the raw materials and building components used in most construction projects. Steel beams, dimensional wood, bolts and fasteners, plumbing fixtures, glass panes, they're all governed by one or more global standards set by large multinational organizations. And I would add the kind of drawing techniques as a type of standard as well. The World Standards Cooperation is the largest in the umbrella organizations for the International Electrotechnical Commission, International Organization of Standardization, and kind of et cetera, et cetera. There's many, many of these. Currently, none of these international material standards administer certification based on recruiting, labor practices, worksite conditions, or any category which we broadly describe as human sustainability. Most deal with sizing and other production variables and allow products to be made in one place and confidently shipped to others to maximize efficiency and low-cost production. A screw pitch is regulated, but not the labor producing the screws. That said, one bright spot is in the work being done at Grace Farms and their Design for Freedom initiative that collates various human rights certifications for the use in architectural supply chain sourcing. And we'll hear more about this later. Like knowledge and labor, construction materials flow globally through an elaborate network of resource relationships and economies. Each material might travel hundreds of miles, crossing its own path, so that value can be added, transforming raw material into products, into assemblies, and then into buildings. This highlights the complex nature of architectural production. There are quite literally tens of thousands of products and even simple projects, each with unique production sites, unique extraction sites, and unique circuits to the job site. The material production process relies on workers around the world engaged with production of materials even before anything arrives to the construction site. So this map shows a small selection of global architectural projects and material production sites. Concrete, for example, is the second most consumed substance in the world behind water. About 10 billion cubic meters of concrete are consumed each year, so around 1 cubic meter for every person on Earth. Concrete employs more than 2 million employees in the United States, and it has an interesting position when it comes to health, safety, and welfare of the public. When concrete rose in the use of the 20th century, it was because it was considered fireproof and earthquake-proof. It was considered safe. But the safety and well-being of people working in the lime mines and breathing polluted air are in decline because of concrete production. Can we say that it is safe? And which site are we solving for? What does safety within the material supply chain if safety of certain people is written out of consideration? More importantly, I think for us to consider, what does safety mean? So this map shows how the job site can be thought of as a site of various accumulations: labor, material, knowledge, governance, but also exploitation. And of course, this is like an incredibly reduced snapshot of what an architectural production site might be. So while theorizing how migrant construction workers' skill sets ascribe forms of subjectivity and humanity, Natasha Iskander reminds us that the construction site is a, quote, vast social system, unquote, and encourages us to think relationally across the different types of people on the job site to bridge different constituencies, sets of expertise, and experiences. It can also be the site for collaboration and coalition building. Thank you.
I must need no introduction, right?
No, you're ready to go.
Hello, thank you so much for having me. It's such a delight to be here in this space with all of you and with Lou and Phil, because I was an associate dean of the problem solving initiative and remember those conversations, what feels like now decades ago, but just a few years ago, of recruiting Lou to Michigan and figuring out a way to make this collaboration happen. So it is just lovely to see it. I'm the one. And so it's such a delight. In teaching the PSI, which was a problem-solving initiative at Michigan, we brought together faculty from multiple disciplines as well as students from multiple disciplines to engage in problem-solving to try to solve real-world problems. We have yet to solve a massive real-world problem, right, because we only have 13 weeks. But we learned lots of things in the work. And one of the things that I want to mention today before I dive into the messy middle of the supply chain, is that when you bring folks from multiple disciplines together, we can think that we speak the same language because we often use the same words, but we often mean them in different ways. And so I want to run you through real quick an exercise we do in the class, which is I want you to think about the word interview in your discipline. And really quickly, I want you to think about why you interview in your discipline and if there are any risks of interviewing in your discipline, whether you're an architect, a lawyer, an engineer, a student, right? And so think. Okay, it may not surprise you to know that in a class of 14 different graduate school disciplines at Michigan Law, only the lawyers answered to win as why you interview, and only the lawyers answered that a risk of interviewing is to lose. So I mentioned that simply because we are coming at these issues from very different perspectives. I remember my co-teacher looking at me and going, "You weaponize interviewing?" And I was like, yes, we do. And so one of my asks for our time together, both today and tomorrow, is that we give ourselves that grace and space to remember that we may think we're saying the same things, but we might have to go under our conversations to learn more about what we're actually saying. I think it's also a great lesson to remember when we're trying to figure out supply chains and we're talking to workers and companies. We may actually be talking past each other lots of times. So it won't surprise anyone, and folks have already signaled this, that modern buildings are astonishingly complex. I've been asked to talk about the messy middle, that I've called it, of manufacturing, extraction, and shipping. And so even though it's messy, and I'm going to really context set a lot of things that are known in this space about how hard it is, how opaque it is, how deep it is, I really want to encourage all of us to think that that hardness, that opaqueness, and that complexity is actually an opportunity. I will show an example at the end of my talk from our lab where we've been using some of that complexity as an opportunity. So a typical architectural project might involve thousands of unique components: structural steel, concrete, glass panels, wires, pipes, fixtures, finishes, and so on. In other words, every building really represents a globalized industry. There could be iron ore from Brazil, which might become structural steel in China, that's fabricated into beams in Vietnam and finally assembled in a site in the US. Similarly, timber from Peru or Russia might be processed into plywood in China and specified by an architect in Europe. This does create complexity. Oh, really complex, right down. Right? And this is just one rendering that I picked, not a super complex supply chain. I actually had thought about just putting up a black slide and saying that's actually the supply chain because there are so many lines going back and forth, and because Phil said I couldn't have words on my slides. There are some words here, but I actually like this one because it includes very, very clearly the role of shipping or trucking here, the role of transport, which is often invisible even in these conversations about supply chains. So we know that there's just multiple tiers of subcontractors and contractors and raw material that's turned into other things that then might be fashioned into one more thing and then transported by another thing, and then finally installed by another thing. It could give us decision paralysis, right? Perhaps the answer to all this work is that the ask is too big for architecture. Maybe this is an ask that is beyond our work. I don't think it is. I think that there are lots of things we can do, but the first thing we have to recognize, as some of the other speakers have mentioned, is that often the risks for forced labor hide further down in the supply chain. It's in the deeper tiers. It's in tier 3 and tier 2, where there's much less visibility. I'm gonna put an asterisk on that. I think there's much less visibility by the end consumer, by the architect, by the construction workers in the US. I don't want us to speak about as if these materials are being created in secret vaults. I think one of the problems we have in this framework when we talk about opaque supply chains is that we act like there's one person doing it behind a vault that no one can see into. And that's simply not true. And if instead we talk about that this type of supply chain represents thousands, perhaps tens of thousands of opportunities for individuals to observe, report, intervene, be a data point, that it really can change how we think about complex supply chains and whether we can see into them. And then if we can see into them, what we might be able to do with that knowledge. I'm not going to spend any time really talking about those opportunities, but seeing in is not enough. we have to be able to then put pressure for better choices to be made. Okay, so I've convinced you that the supply chain is complex. I've framed for you that materials from almost anywhere can be mashed together in lots of different ways, and that we need to be paying attention. I'm only skipping some of this because other people have talked about it. Oops, wrong way. See? Okay, so I want to talk about shipping. So I don't know if any of you have kids, if you have seen these great cross-section books by Richard Platt and Stephen Beersley, and they do these great things where they show you all the complexities in a building or in a castle or here in a ship. And I put this on here because I'm talking about we should be concerned about the forced labor potentially in the shipping process, but we can't forget that the ship itself, right, has a bunch of components and a bunch of layers. So then I'm making it even more complex. And it could be easy for us to say, let's not worry about it. And David Blight mentioned today that in historical times at Yale, that slavery was an unthinking part of our environment. I would actually say that is still true today, not just at Yale, but in all of these systems, that slavery and forced labor are often unthinking parts of our environment, unless you are like me, many of us in this room probably are, that we are thinking about that lots of times. But in general, we accept the fact that forced labor, exploited labor is part of all of these supply chains, and that is simply part of being a consumer in the current economy. I mean, I carry one of these. I have no belief that this is a slave-free supply chain in the technology that I carry in my hand. So why architects, right? I've just laid out that, we have all of these decisions to make. How can one person make all of these decisions in an ethical way that prevents forced labor? I'm not sure any one person can. All supply chains are products of multiple systems and regulatory structures, but architects by their nature are problem solvers. At least that's what Phil tells me. And if Phil says it's true, I'm going to believe it, right? The architects by their nature are problem solvers. And they know that their decisions can either perpetuate or prevent forced labor. We have seen in the construction industry an acceptance of thinking about embodied carbon, and we're seeing a movement around embodied labor or embodied justice. It is possible to make this framework part of our thinking. I think it's also possible because of the complexity of the supply chain. Oh, I'm getting it totally wrong. So here's one of the images that I took that's not a supply chain image, but I flagged it because I liked it. It kind of shows that really, if you're building a building, you need to be thinking about all of these things all the time, right? What's happening in India? What's happening in China? What's happening in Brazil? Where are those parts coming from? Where are they being fabricated? And so that's the task. So just solve it by noon tomorrow. And then, right? But other people have this same task. I would push to say that really the people who build this have a very similar task. While the components are not as large, there are probably over 1,000 components in this iPhone, right? They're really teeny, teeny, tiny. And we know that other industries are figuring out some solutions that we might want to look to in architecture and in construction. Chavi Nana, my colleague, is going to talk a little bit more about due diligence and legal frameworks and regulatory structures that exist. But I want to highlight just quickly the tech industry and how they do supply chain management. They have faced much public pressure over blood minerals and sweatshop assembly. They have instituted codes of conduct for suppliers and third-party audits, which have their own costs and benefits, risks, pros and cons. They put in compliance programs for conflict minerals. They have they've leveraged through collection action a way to be able to trace parts of their supply chain. None of this is perfect, and none of this is a one-stop solution for the complexity of this supply chain, especially for items that need to be manufactured, extracted, and shipped. But we're not alone. I guess part of what I want to say to this group and to architects is that you're not alone. There are other groups grappling with it. And so we should look to them to see how to improve our work in this space. So this is one of my favorite design thinking questions and what I want to use my last few minutes for. I've already mentioned the tech sector. But the real question is, how might we think differently about supply chains? How might we view the complexity as an opportunity? And so I want you to take a minute and have you think. So right now, most supply chain regulation happens like, right, we ask corporations to disclose things, or we ask people to go into the final, I'll call it end user, and do audits. Or we may say, let's ask workers how things are doing. But what if I said, I need you to make a supply chain more transparent by not relying on either end of it? And in fact, I want you to do it using social media. That was the task that the students in my human trafficking lab had to do for an agricultural supply chain. And so, that's why I have AI here as the third piece. We were asked to do this task with legal compelled service, which is called student work. And we did it successfully. And now we're working with some of our colleagues in engineering to figure out how to do it using AI and other machine learning. And let me just flag, I'm going to say words like machine learning and scraping. I don't know what half that stuff means. That's why I have other people who help me. So don't ask me the tech questions. Ask Seth. So what we really did for an agricultural supply chain is H-2A visas are for agricultural workers. And at least as of 8 a.m. this morning, you can still download H-2A work orders off of a government website. So we took that work order, it has the name of the farm, and in agricultural supply chains, just like those in construction, people say, it's so hard, it's so complex, we can't tell you. Kroger, I don't know where I buy my cherries, for example. And so we thought, here is a group of workers that are at risk of exploitation. Can we, from this, figure out where the products that they are harvesting are going? In other words, can we go from soil to shelf without getting disclosures from companies? And the answer is yes. And here's why. Because people post all sorts of things on the internet. Like, they just post all the stuff. And so what we started doing, which I can talk to folks in more detail, is we would scrape the address and then try to verify that the address was actually a farm. And then the students did Google searches to figure out if we could see anything. And this farm, award-winning as it is, when you search this address, you find out that, and do a MapQuest page, you find out that this farm is actually a farm that's on the work order, and that the farmer got an award for being an outstanding Georgia peanut farmer. So the students started with the work order, did some research, and found this. This is the kind of stuff we would find. We would keep it all in a spreadsheet because the computer engineers would tell us that we had to know our decision-making process. And then they would also, and these became the real goldmine of what we would find on Google reviews, Facebook postings, I'm blanking on some of the other spaces we found it. People would talk about, sometimes this is actually a transport person, so someone in the supply chain says, I'm an owner-operator loaded at Crenshaw, the farm I showed you before, going to Food Lion in Greenville, South Carolina for broker Red Lab Logistics. Anyway, load got rejected because of bad quality melons. So now we know that something from Crenshaw Farms is going to Food Lion. So now we have from soil to shelf, and this was always just out there, publicly available. I didn't have a special code to find this because people complain a lot on the internet, if you didn't know that. And when they complain, they often complain about the things that they purchase, about their blueberries, about their melons. And so we were able to systematically start going through the H-2A work orders and match up soil to shelf, where these workers were and where the products were going at the end time. Now, is this a solution to the entire complex supply chain issue that we're facing here today? No. But I offer it as an example to encourage us to think beyond how we're using data currently, especially in the age of AI, to say, what does it mean to be working in a supply chain that has thousands of points of contact and thousands of eyes on it? And how might we leverage those eyes and those points of contact to help us reduce forced labor. Thank you.
All right. Phil, where's that timer you promised me? Oh, getting set right there. And is this prop water? Am I allowed to? Okay, cool. It's been sitting there. I've been looking at it. Good. Well, now I've claimed it. Good. Still morning, everyone. So I can see this right here. So we'll consider this provocation, right? There's no disclaimer. There's no solutions here, but really a provocation towards how I'd say the profession, the practice, and the discipline of architecture could actually do something to address the question of equity in the supply chain. Let's see if I get, excellent, great. So we're going to start with what I'll call the HSW architect, right? This is just taken from the New York State example. I'm sorry, it won't all be wonky like this. We'll move through it, but again, there's a lot of lawyers in the room though, so I think this is okay. And Phil, I didn't know you had a prohibition against showing words on the slides. I apologize, there's going to be words on the slides. You don't have to read them all. But long story short, architects in the United States as a professional project truly anchored on protecting the health, safety, and welfare of the public as kind of the primary justification for why someone like me as a licensed architect can call myself an architect and a general member of the population cannot, right? And there's very good reasons for this, right? The 1908 Iroquois fire in Chicago was a disaster, and I think there were many, many disasters, and part of the reason for creating the first law for licensure in architecture in 1897 in Illinois was because it was, a very noble, justified project to protect the health, safety, and welfare of the public. However, what that means is basically architecture and its assessments, in many cases, the competencies of what allows you to be an architect is really anchored around what I'll call like the life safety architect, okay? So that brings us to architectural competency today. This is, a slide from a recent report from a work study group that came out of NCARB, the National Council of Architectural Registration Boards, which coordinates between all the various state licensing boards across the United States, establishing 16 core competencies. I'm not going to read them all to you here. I don't expect you to read them all here. It's really to show you that there is an ongoing effort now to actually pin down what is the body of knowledge that makes an architect a competent architect. And I'll just say, spoiler alert, is that a number of these things are entirely valid things architects do, but also there's a number of these competencies which are increasingly coming under threat, eroding as technology is advancing and actually taking on a lot of these bodies of knowledge, right? This is a piece that was recently published in the most recent issue of Harvard Design Magazine that I co-edited. Phil was a contributor to this issue, among others from Yale, this is a conversation we organized, which was bringing together the heads of the AIA, the American Institute of Architects, the head of the ABA, the American Bar Association, the head of the American Medical Association as well, along with Daniel Susskind, who co-wrote The Future of the Professions. He's an economist based in Cambridge, really talking about the professional project, especially in the United States and the UK, but also elsewhere, and how that is being eroded now by multiple forces, political, social, but also technological. And the takeaway from this that I see is that, anchoring on this notion of a health, safety, and welfare architect, if that's what we're saying is the body of knowledge that justifies us in being an architect, that's going to become increasingly tenuous as a lot of that body of knowledge has already been offloaded to codes, other regulatory regimes, and frankly, the tests that we use to assess competence in architecture, the AREs, are becoming increasingly passable by this technology. Which brings to the question I have is how could we rethink HSW, especially the W in HSW, the welfare component of health, safety, and welfare. So if you look at, zooming in on that competency task force slide I shared with you before, these are the sections that actually deal with the welfare, well-being aspect. And as you can see, it mostly is focusing on environmental concerns. Makes a lot of sense. That is something we've been, building performance, energy performance, environmental performance has been in the wind for a long time now, and it also is very measurable. So that is right now what architects are, as a profession, we see are really gravitating towards that as our expanded definition of welfare. But in the context of today and tomorrow, I would really challenge us to ask, could we expand that further and actually include many of the factors and issues that we're talking about in this room today? So what are some barriers to doing that, right? I think it's important to acknowledge that at this outset. One, obviously, is just the enormous resistance within any profession, right, towards internal change and especially adopting positions. This is, many of us may be aware of the long, long debate over actually something which now seems quaint, right, which was actually the AIA taking a position on designing torture chambers, in other words, solitary confinement facilities, and execution chambers. This was resisted for years by the AIA. And in fact, I won't go into the great detail of this, but you can see the statements from the AIA, everything I highlighted there, ranging from arguments that it would open a Pandora's box of proposals or demands for similar rules, or even that it would somehow violate antitrust law, right? Eventually, that was overcome. And in 2020, it was overcome. AIA now actually includes that in its, and I'll get to that in the next slide. Other barriers, right? This is a slide on the right, which is just a representative research project for some of my students in my Frameworks of Practice course at the GSD, where a student group was really trying to just pick apart, and we've seen other slides like this today as well, we'll see more, just trying to actually understand where the various components of a particular building project come from. As has been mentioned, incredibly difficult, but also, as the last speaker pointed out, it is knowable, it is visible. The question is, what do we take a position on with regards to it? But also other barriers, simply in the top left, just basically the contract structure and contractual relationships between the key players, particularly in the United States, as I'm showing here, between an owner, an architect, a contractor. This is, again, it creates barriers to how, as architects, we can actually influence these decisions. Finally, also, just the complexity of not just projects, but the documentation around that. This is the slide on the bottom left is another research project that was printed in the most recent issue of Harvard Design Magazine, Instruments of Service, which is looking at the increasing complexity in architectural services contracts. If you look on the, it's a kind of the graphic even reads from here. If you see on the far left on that black and white diagram, that is the standard form AIA architect owner contract from 1917. If you look on the far right, that is 2017. You can see the explosion in simply the number of pages, indicating the increasing complexity of architectural projects and architects' relationships to the production of buildings. That said, as I want to, this is all not doom and gloom and barriers. There are precedents for where the profession has actually been able to push through these barriers. This is, as I alluded to before, the debate about banning the design of, or participation in the design of execution chambers and torture facilities or solitary confinement chambers was actually overcome in 2020. It is now adopted into the AIA Code of Ethics. You can see the language here. You can look it up. This was a major shift showing that something even as ossified and intractable to change as the American Institute of Architects can make change. Other precedents, which I'm sure we'll have plenty about, for better or for worse, is, we have precedents for actually quantifying very complicated components and systems and buildings and actually assigning scores to them, which become incentives not just to owners and clients, but also to architects who are incentivized to chase these certifications. I think as Sheila pointed out, there's also a kind of downsides to that as well. But again, I'm showing that this is possible. And this brings some questions, which I will then end with here, is one, so what do architects need to do, or what can we do? What does this demand if we're going to be engaged in these questions? One is, I think we need to be asking ourselves, do we need new instruments of service, right? Are there new things architects would need to make in order to engage meaningfully in this discussion, in this movement? One, basic one that architects, especially earlier in their careers, I spend half my time talking to students, half my time talking to owners of firms, but especially earlier on, no one is interested in learning or talking anything about specifications or specs, right? I think there's enormous opportunity in rethinking specs and specifications, and frankly, more and more of my students are very interested in that, right? In actually writing the building, that's where the rubber hits the road, and I think there's enormous opportunity, not just in the current form of specifications, but in actually ways we can leverage technology. This is just a BIM model from a Herzog-Gadamer project, just showing, something that we're very familiar with at this point, the kind of the BIM promise, but actually the idea of truly integrating the drawings, the models that architects produce with these specifications. Could we actually leverage that as designers to start to build more intelligence and frankly a more critical attitude about sourcing and supply chain far earlier in the design process? So it's not just something that's being talked about on the job site or once we're dealing with material suppliers and contractors. One example of this, I don't know, anyone familiar with Michael K. Chen architecture in New York? All right, this is an example of a very good, really smaller, mid-sized practice in New York City, which has adopted a practice of writing into their specifications, right, basically the requirement that this signage be placed on site, okay? Now, they will be the first to admit this is imperfect, it's a first step, but what Michael and his team have done is they have introduced this language on the left into their specifications, which requires the placement of these signs. They're developing other ones around the construction site, specifically to address issues of forced labor on the construction site itself. Question?
And those survived the contract with the contractor?
They did. Yep. Now again, I've talked to Michael and his team about this, there's an issue in the actual enforcement because there's actually a whole other backstory about the helpline and whether or not if you call the helpline, if that the issue they have is that immediately triggers a legal response, which then discourages people from actually calling the helpline. So again, there's externalities which this is not solving for, but it's showing, for me, I think it's really important, especially in rooms of designers who feel like, what can I do tomorrow about this? This is something that an architect is actually doing in New York today that is actually making a difference in this issue on the site in day-to-day projects, okay? Another one, and this, we're always trying to find different ways of doing these contract diagrams. Jordan showed one before. This is I'm experimenting with a more jaunty version. I don't know. It's hard to see people not to eyes glaze over when you see these, but I think we really do need to think seriously, and this excites me, about really the relationships between the key players. If we go through here, we see on the top left our standard owner, architect, contractor, design, bid, build, contract relationships. Other schemes, which we can see around here. But I think if we talk about what is the architect's role in shaping these supply chain issues and questions, addressing questions around that, is where does the architect live in this both contract structure and hence in the kind of decision-making structure? So we have our typical, is this the top thing point, or which one's gonna? I pushed the bad one. Okay. This is like a trick. It's like there's like this one or this one, and then I just lost like a minute now. Okay. Should I click through it, or are they going to reset it?
Trevor, can you get us back to where we need to be?
You should have like an X on this button so nobody pushes it. There, okay, the one that, great, beautiful. All right, I can drive from here on. Thank you very much. All right, so standard, we see these design build, but I'm interested, frankly, in other models. Perhaps we might find that actually the architect acting as an independent entity, as a contract or as a consultant contractor, we have a certain amount of agency and leverage in that model. But there's other models such as fully integrated design, build, operate practices, which actually have far more visibility upstream across the whole spectrum. Like I personally experienced that, full disclosure, a number of years working for WeWork and their in-house design, build, and operate teams, where we had complete visibility into this supply chain. And frankly, there were decisions we could make on the fly, like when Mikhail McKelvey decided to ban, or the leadership decided to ban plastics, or basically single-use plastics. That was implemented in the space of less than weeks, right? And that actually then trickled down into questions about how we basically started to remove plastics from a lot of the furniture and other systems we were speccing in projects. So I think that models like that, which sometimes kind of raise up the prickles among architects, or like, oh, we're going to lose our independence. Like perhaps we should be looking into models that actually do put all the players within one organization as one way of actually addressing this. I would say these, is another way of saying this is looking at kind of the delivery of space or architecture as actually approaching architecture as like a spatial product delivery enterprise, right? If we treat these as spatial products, I think that actually shifts our mindset somewhat into thinking more holistically about what we're doing, which again, perhaps would give architects and designers more agency further upstream. However, on the right, this kind of like crazy, octopus diagram is actually also, I think we should be thinking about potentially entirely different models for what the architect is. This is showing, this kind of the truncated architect triangle. Perhaps we just need another type of architect. The fact that we have arrived at the model we have today of an architect, health safety architect as a consultant, right? This is something that was designed 150 to really 120 years ago, this kind of relationship between a contractor, an owner, and an architect. There was a time before that where actually architects were far more involved in basically we call now the general contractor role. And architects as a profession, for a number of reasons, one including the fact that they simply did not set their 6% fees high enough to cover that type of services, offloaded a lot of the scope of work to the contractor, became the general contractor. And architects are in many ways, and there's a lot of, George Johnson's written about this, there's a lot of scholarship about this, architects are in many ways responsible for the creation of the general contractor role. And 100 years later, we're moaning about the fact that we've lost control and lost visibility into the subcontractors and basically where a lot of the rubber hits the road when it comes to sourcing materials and means and methods. So perhaps it could have gone in totally many different directions. One direction possibly, what if there had become a public architect role? What if we didn't focus fully on the kind of professional services model and actually moved, as some countries have done, where the architect is much more of a public-facing entity who perhaps would have maybe not contractual but a regulatory finger or hands actually kind of examining or having visibility into all these other kind of areas of the project delivery down further change. That might actually give us a totally different way of impacting this issue. Projective, but I think this is the types of stuff I'd love to see us talking more about over the coming day. But I'd like to end on this slide, which is that I think ultimately, you really can't, and when I talk to my students and others about, when I talk about architecture, I think we really need to think of it as like 3 interrelated but separate circles, right, or domains, right? We have really a discipline which is largely, really 15th century Renaissance in the West, a Renaissance project we have till today, which is really, as you can see in the words, this is like the idea of architecture as an intellectual project. This goes back to Alberti, if you want to get into it. Alberti in 1452 basically invented the idea to cite Mario Carpo, who's written extensively about this, invented the idea of an architect as someone who conceives of a project in their head, draws it, and then expects someone else actually to build it as they thought of it, as they drew it. That didn't exist before then. Now, the practice of architecture has existed for millennia, as in the kind of designing, delivering, building of buildings, that's existed for millennia. It is incredibly agnostic to a lot of the questions we're bringing up today. It simply adapts to technology, adapts to the context of its time. That has gone back forever. And the profession, on the other hand, which we often spend a lot of time talking about, is really a very new 19th century project, right? So I think if we talk about addressing supply chain equity, I've talked mostly today, I think, about profession, perhaps, and practice in this very short, blurb. But I think we also would be remiss if we didn't talk about how we change and shape the discipline so that it takes these questions seriously. Because frankly, a lot of the time that we spend in rooms like this and in schools is really focused on disciplinary questions. And that's where architects and their values are created in many cases. And that has impact far downstream. And if we don't change the conversation in schools, I think we won't be able to tackle this if we're only looking in the practice and professional circles. So with that, I will end. Thank you very much.
Okay, we're going to have a conversation. I'll then invite the speakers from the first session to come up.
What do you want to be on screen with the...
Actually, put your crazy project delivery diagrams up.
All right.
And Jacob, as my former student, I'm so happy to see someone else putting project delivery diagrams up. It just warms my heart.
Phil actually did that at the law school. Where's the lawyers?
That's right. Where's the lawyers? Where's my box? All right, so I think Lou and I will ask a couple of questions, and then, dude, where's please, have a seat. So, Lou, I'm going to start, and then you can jump in.
So, yeah, you want us closer to each other? Okay. We're going to do this. Great. Thanks.
So, guys, I want to, during the course of the time that Lou and I taught our course, we've seen this very interesting progression in our students' attitudes. Our students come into the classroom, and Griffin's here, so he can comment on this. Our students come into the classroom, and the first question is, what are you talking about? And we have no grasp of this problem whatsoever. And we get a couple of weeks into the semester, and we do some work, and David comes in, he gives some background, and I do some technical stuff, and I get blamed for all the problems of American project delivery. And then we get to this moment in the semester that we've started to call the Valley of Despair. And the Valley of Despair is the moment when our students go, this is such a terrible problem, we cannot possibly solve it, but we have an answer, because we're students. The answer is, we must destroy global capitalism. That's the answer. And we say, okay, that's an interesting idea. Maybe not the subject of this course. So what we might need are some more proximate answers to the question. So I'm interested in your opinions about where we might turn next. We've seen a variety of options here. Somebody want to jump in? Actually, Sheila, why don't you jump in first?
I have to say at Transparent, sometimes when we're having a brainstorm and trying to get to the root cause, that's also what we
The Valley of Despair.
Yeah, it's just capitalism. I mean, the system that I live in. I think but even a capitalist system tries to work for the people, right? You need your power. You need sustainable economic development and all of these foundational things. You need to make sure that corporations are not people. I mean, I think you need to look at every single thing. You need to look at, tax law, and then, then we can just solve everything. All of our state
Dude.
Well, only that we've done 2 working groups on modern slavery in different forms at our center over the past decade, and the same thing always happens. These are scholars of many different disciplines, including lawyers, come together from all over the world, and we produce conferences out of this, books out of this. But at some point, somebody says, "What are we really solving here?" Well, trying to get rid of capitalism. I mean, some in the group sort of start with that, but this was always sort of, and yet that, of course, is not the answer. In our case, what we did is history about this, and then the contemporary issues of this, only to find out how crazy complicated it is, and how, if this is a field of study, modern slavery is kind of an inchoate field of study, it has many divisions within it, like any field of study. People don't always agree on the best methods. In fact, the last book we did, which is called Modern Slavery, and then it has a big subtitle, was all about what strategies have worked. This kind of what abolition strategies have worked or not worked. We went at it from that direction. What has been done over, say, the last decades that may have succeeded here in this way or that way, and that was a way, at least. It was a road, at least, into this enormously complex problem when we kind of treated it from the perspective of abolition. But here, I was struck at your presentation, especially, this middling middle, or what do you call it, messy middle. Messy middle. Is there somewhere along that line? And was that a tweet you put up or an email? Yeah. That last line sticks with me. We don't get paid, Interventions probably have to begin at that kind of level. And that's not what historians or architects are necessarily trained to do. I'm not helping you out here. I'm just saying we've done whole conferences only to learn people disagree, and it's really complex.
I'd love to, I was going to see if I could follow on right there. That notion of not just the capitalism conversation, which I think something that necessarily needs to be had, but also the pit of despair conversation. Like, I don't think that we're the only PSI that has a pit of despair. If you choose a big, wicked problem for the students to work on, at some point they will realize, and of course they'll be like, why did you do this to us?
Yes.
And we're like, no, slavery's food. That's to the world, and you're near it, and you are now feeling this. But the guys on the job site in Qatar are feeling it. They are in a bit of despair as well. And they can't climb out as quickly as the students. So I'd love to hear, not just to the degree that some of these bigger structural issues around whether it's globalization or capitalism or patriarchy, how one deals with those things, because they are things that need to be dealt with. But then at the same time, how do we get it so that the students can work in service of the wicked problem that they're trying to face?
So I think the pit of despair, one of the reasons it emerges so quickly in these spaces is that when we work in monodisciplinary spaces, right, we just work within our discipline, we know where we think the answer is supposed to come from. If I'm in a rule of lawyers, what's the answer? The law. Well, and lawyers will say it's the law every time we're in a space, right? But it's like almost when we invite other disciplines, my toolbox gets moved to the side. And so I don't have the same tools to pull out. And so then I go, wait, I have to answer this question like without already having a preset idea of the tools I'm going to use. I actually think that's the opportunity, but students don't feel that way because we're grading them and all of that. And I would argue that sometimes we don't feel that way when we're in spaces of multiple disciplines. It's much harder for me to sit in a room with Phil and understand his tools and understand his words and understand his diagrams and try to find something that is a better or different solution than I would come up in a room by myself. Now, I actually think that idea that a room full of people from multiple disciplines have identified the answer as a human-made economic system is actually quite empowering, because we're not saying that the problem of forced labor is that the weather dictates it, or that it's created by Mother Nature, or that it's a disease we don't have the medicine to solve. What we're saying is a man-made or human-made economic system that that we set the rules for, right, and that we decide the regulation of. Doesn't mean to have all the solutions, but gosh, like it means it's us, and it means we fix
let's
it.
talk about that for a minute, because these systems that these are Jacob's diagrams, of course. They describe a delivery construct that is predicated on really one shared principle, which is lowest first cost. Everybody's trying to optimize for lowest first cost, which means every relationship in the system has that pressure on it. And because the system is so complex, it's very easy to sort of disabuse yourself of that. And the building industry is famous for creating these externalities, right? There's carbon in that, that's the way it goes. There's suffering in that, that's the way it goes. But I mean, what was interesting about that New York Times article that somebody put up was, it was you, right? Was they didn't explain why the labor costs were going up. The labor costs were going up because the labor force on that project was being abused. So how do you change that? David, when I've been looking at your Connecticut Hall stuff, we have incredibly detailed records of how buildings get built and what gets bought and who works. We just can't get to them. We can't do the kind of forensics that you're talking about. So what do we do about that, Jacob?
He runs a tough summer.
I do.
Yeah. Can this hear me? So, Phil, restate the specific question.
How, in the same way that Alberti set up this construct of abstraction and construction, now we have this reciprocal or kind of denominator of the system, which is all about lowest first cost. Everything's about lowest first cost, which has created this externality of forced labor. How does that question get addressed in this kind of an approach?
Yeah, I think, well, an honest answer would be the first step is accepting that perhaps things have to cost more.
Okay.
Right, and a tried and true way of doing that is forcing that is through regulation, right? I think that with the exception of particular clients, let's just be honest, the architecture industry, honestly, the construction industry has such low margins, we know this, right? That asking them to reduce their margins is going to be very, very difficult, just real talk. So I think the only path that I see is really through regulation and outside requirements that exist perhaps outside the professional industry.
Jordan, you agree?
I mean, I do think regulation to a certain extent would help. I mean, in a way, one of the answers or one of the proposals would be also the answer to kind of global capitalism, which is trying to figuring out how to combine and coalition some of these different factors together. Because it's not just working with kind of regulation architecture, but regulation architecture workers, unions, organizations to collate and bring together a lot of the work that's already taken place, because a lot of it is disparate. And so if some of the regulations that already exist were worked into some of the contracts, maybe that would be a way to not change the law, but change the way in which contracts are adjudicated, or the way in which oversight could take place. From, based on a lot of the work that I do, a lot of the conversation is shifting, and it's shifting because of the work that's being done has been conducted in universities, and the teaching and the awareness of these issues is much higher than it was 5, 10, 15 years ago. And so I think the questions around labor that my students are thinking about start first at labor within the office, which seems obvious, but then it goes very quickly to labor outside the office, labor to the job site, labor to the supply chain. So I think there's a real thirst for making the process more more just. And so in a way, I feel like we have to catch up to where the students are to a certain effect, and work about building larger coalitions. And I think, because a lot of the work is being done, it's just being done over here and not over here. And the methods of sharing, I think, could be, that's the answer to global capitalism, right? It takes a lot of work to combine forces.
I just want to make one quick clarification to my statement about more regulation, is that I actually think really what that also requires is, since we as it's become more and more clear in dialogues in many circles, right, is that one of the issues with, well, just housing affordability, right, is actually the explosion of certain types of regulations. So I think it actually is going to force, if you're going to address this, you have to acknowledge that we have to make hard decisions about what we want to regulate and what we're willing to let slide, right? And that comes down to something like, for example, just to say one that comes up every day for me living in a landmark district in Brooklyn, right, is are we willing to give that up to drive down a cost if that means actually not having forced labor on a site or involved in projects, right? Those are hard. That's an easy one, right, to bring up. But we're going to have to really dig into those questions, because the answer is not simply to pile on more regulations, because it will simply become impossible to build in the United States.
I also think I really want to get away from even using the word opaque with supply chains, because lots of times they're not opaque. We're just not using the information. Like you said, deep, and I was like, yes, let's always use deep, because these companies, especially in the agriculture context, if my students can spend 13 weeks and figure that out, those companies who should, if the laws and regulations that currently exist were effectively enforced, have a lot more on the line to know that workers are being exploited. But when we sit around and say, oh, supply chains are opaque, no, there's thousands of people touching them. And so, right, we might not have the ways to collect information, we might not have those other things, but I think we are giving corporations a way to let themselves off the hook and not disclose things and say they know things when we talk about it like that.
Yeah, but I'm trying I want to just say one thing. I was trying to figure out what the building industry analog to soil to shelf was. And what is it, from mine to curtain wall? I mean, there's this, it's not the supply chain may not be opaque, but it's really long.
Yeah, and I'm definitely not saying that you can use that same method, but you don't find other people using social media postings to make things transparent right now in supply chain. But in general supply chain work, right? And so we have to think about what are the ways, acknowledging that there are thousands of humans in that chain who are not part of the forced labor construct, and leverage that.
David?
A question. Do architects have a lobby? No. The reason I ask is, seriously, I mean, in my profession right now, historians, we're wishing we did. Cause,
maybe we should join up, because...
Well, you guys have probably a legal defense fund, and we don't.
No.
Okay, well, all right, but so many of these are moral and political questions. And Mr. Ambassador, I mean, God, do you know that? You ran the State Department's office about this. You know how political this can be from the top. I'm not suggesting I know how to do this, but we're really struggling among historians right now to figure out, so how can we lobby for ourselves? Now, there's probably never been a political lobbying division of the Architects Association, I'm sure.
Oh, there is.
There is.
There's one guy.
One guy, okay, yeah.
He works one day a week.
Oh,
No,
okay,
I'm just
yeah.
kidding.
Well, we need some pro bono lawyers who, I'm serious. I mean, because ultimately these are political problems, certainly if it's regulation. We don't live in a time now when lobbying anybody may do anything, but we may survive this. I don't know. Mr. Ambassador, well, it's a political problem.
One of the things that I think is interesting here is that this idea of not self-regulation, but I think that a lot of industry associations or professional organizations recognize, especially in the last 8 weeks, as we've seen a lot of kind of core assumptions overturned, that, I talked to my doctor's sister, and the doctors, if they even know that somebody has a brother that's a lawyer, they shun each other. But that idea of, it's spooky is what it is. It's eerie how that happens. But
These trial lawyers, they're really good, aren't they?
But I think one of the things that you end up seeing there is that whether it's the Pathologists Association or whether it's the AMA itself, they actually welcome. They don't want to admit it in public, but they actually welcome some level of regulation. They want to be part of that level of regulation because then they know that there's not folks who are charging, $400,000 for a placental bandage when you can actually just have a Band-Aid to do that. They end up having to police their profession. I think we see that in profession after profession after profession, that there is, over the last 100 years, this idea of, even if it's in a capital system, that regulation, whether it's by the group or by the government or some combination of the two, actually allows that system to work. I think one of the things that we're seeing, and we're going to be hearing about worker-led social responsibility and some of the other concepts this afternoon, is that notion of who are the people who should properly be in that conversation, rather than simply leaving it to the CEO or the industry association. But why aren't the patients part of that? Why aren't the workers part of that? Why aren't the survivors part of that? And that, I think, is one of the things that the students, when they're crawling out of the pit of despair, they start saying, okay, patriarchy, we're going to keep pushing against it. And global capitalism and the unfairnesses of it, we're going to keep pushing against it. And we're going to understand where it started. Jordan and his team found it starting in the 1600s in Long Island Sound, as the British Empire sourced building materials from where we are standing, because there weren't big enough trees down in Barbados to build all those mansions. And so that idea of what we think of as global capitalism and slavery and exploitation, yes, they do grow up together, and we have to understand that. But also, how do we start getting those other voices into the conversation rather than simply saying, okay, bosses, you're the only ones who get to have the conversation.
Right, or architects, you're the only ones who can control
It's
this.
like everybody-
Sheila, do you buy this argument?
I definitely think that worker-driven social responsibility programs are an answer, maybe one of the biggest pieces to it. I think the complication is that what we see right now, it's very localized per sector, per geography. So how do you expand that? And then how do you go deeper into the supply chains?
Yeah. I mean, that makes sense because, I mean, the bad news is the supply chain is complex and long. But the good news is, at least in our industry, we touch almost every part of it, right, except for the food piece. So,
Phil, I know that we've got time issues. I was wondering if
Yeah.
I could tee up a very quick speed round.
yeah, but we
with-
do want to let these folks ask
Exactly,
questions.
with a very quick provocation. David's work on the Reconstruction era and the lost cause mythology of the South, I think kind of tees up for us what you heard a little bit today, which is the links to which people will go to either reclassify, euphemize, or otherwise hide things to be able to say, that's not slavery, that's not forced labor, that's not whatever it is that we feel icky about. And I think that notion of even saying, oh, well, those people are undocumented on the job site, as opposed to saying, those people are victims of wage theft, or those people are human trafficking victims, or this or that. And so I wanted to maybe just do a very quick, like a one-sentence speed round of where do people see slavery as being hidden from us? What are the euphemisms that you're hearing, or what are the avoidance techniques that you've seen, whether it's companies, whether it's countries, whether it's just society as a whole, to basically try to avoid this? Because if we can figure out where people are avoiding it now, maybe we have a leverage point that we can carry into this afternoon and tomorrow.
I think we should start with Jordan and end with
Yeah.
David. Yeah.
I think that, I mean, there's a lot of places where it's hidden or unseen, but I think people understand. I think that they get overwhelmed with thinking about it. So it's not that they don't recognize, like everybody knows the iPhone. A lot of people know the iPhone has a type of embedded forced labor or slavery into it, but they get, exhausted by thinking about it, or overwhelmed by thinking they're going to switch to something else, which also has these problems. So it's not that it's hidden. It's that it's very open, but the avenues for addressing it are perhaps too murky, or maybe that's the unseen part.
Sheila?
And it could be hidden or avoided. I think is kind of what Jordan's setting up for us.
I think especially when you're talking about migrant workers, saying that the job that they have now, even though there is exploitation, is still better than their circumstance in their home area. So because of that, I'm actually, helping by purchasing these products.
Yeah, I think, frankly, just, architects, since I'm talking about the profession, like avoidance of getting involved in means and methods.
Hiding behind the pen.
Yeah.
Or hiding behind the pencil.
I think that things that we classify as domestic or family labor still, we have this history in the U.S. of thinking about agrarian work and other things. I'm thinking about a case that we lost in the Sixth Circuit where a trafficker faked a family, and the court essentially said, well, he's a parent to these kids, and he wasn't. But and the court said it was okay. And another court just came out recently in a similar case and said, well, effectively you can do that to kids, but you can't do that to a wife. Great, I'm glad about that part. But that we still say you can kind of do it to kids, and you're seeing some narratives as foreign workers are leaving about child labor laws being rolled back. And so I do think about work that happens in the context of family.
Well, from the perspective of my guild, it's anywhere people want their history to please them, about a narrative of progress and always improvement, and not about stories of human exploitation. Millions of people prefer history to make them sleep well at night, and much of it won't. It's fascinating because it won't. But it's, and now we have lots of people in great positions of power trying to dictate what that history should be. So it's anywhere. People simply don't want to face this history, whether it's in building materials and human labor or any other way. It's a vast problem.
Okay, we have a couple of minutes for a few questions before we break for lunch. Are there questions? Well, gosh, Nancy, you want to go first? Nothing like calling on your wife to ask the first question. Hold on.
All right, I want to open a can of worms. So far in this room, I think we all agree that there is a perfect moral and ethical case for eliminating forced labor. The part of the system that I don't think anyone has referred to, except maybe Jordan just a touch in that last answer, is what about the exploiters? They don't agree. And can we bring in a conversation about how to create something that is a better alternative for them, as opposed to the pressure and control strategies that we've all been talking about? Is there a way to make it just not as attractive as it used to be?
Yeah. So a lot of my experiences with the garment industry, so I can talk about that. So if you're looking at who the exploiter is, you'll say, okay, well, it's the supplier. But then you need to go deeper and say, okay, well, why are they exploiting these people? We work with some suppliers that are awful people, but most of them are running a business. And if you're looking at contract clauses from the buyers, you can see that they're very unfavorable to the suppliers. And sometimes if you're trying to make things happen, maybe during changed timeframes based on something that happened with the buyers, well, you have labor and capital, and you can't do anything with your capital, so the only thing that's going to happen is labor. Forced overtime, lower wages, unauthorized subcontracting. I mean, that's just one example, but even when we see all this mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence legislation, it seems like the people that are actually going to be figuratively or literally paying for it are going to be the suppliers, which is going to be an added burden. If we're looking at tariffs, well, obviously the consumers are going to be paying higher prices, but also the suppliers are going to be making less profits. So again, who's the one who's going to be hurting? It's going to be the supplier. So I mean, we definitely need shared, stronger relationships between buyers and suppliers. I mean, it's kind of this idea of maybe this like huge, worker-driven social responsibility program, because it has to be something that the buyers, then also the investors, and we have the expert on investors, Chavi, who can speak more to that later. But it needs to be the entire chain that's making sure that they're not creating conditions of exploitation, which then the supplier will make. And this is just one example, supplier, because you also have, farmers, right? There's been a lot of work on farmers, so what about the actual farm workers? You have, the recruitment agencies, but this is just one example how, they're not always the bad people. They're kind of trying to survive in this, system of exploitation.
Okay.
I'm just curious if there's a history of automation eliminating some of the human labor problems in these industries.
Jacob, you want to take that one?
Yes. There's certainly. Well, I will focus specifically on building and architecture. That certainly, as processes have become automated, that has reduced some amount of manual labor, and frankly, like the introduction of construction equipment, right, has vastly increased the kind of capacity of any individual construction worker to do. Like, we don't need armies of slaves to build, like, as the pyramid builder is needed, right? So yes, I think it has not solved it. And me going back just quickly to that, also relates to that previous question. I think that in the case of building, like, we're all complicit, and I think that. I think actually, Jordan, the Times stat that you showed, right, that shows it that stat tells it all, right? If you simply take a percentage, you remove a percentage of undocumented workers in the industry now, the cost of construction goes up exponentially. And as you mentioned, right, those undocumented workers is a euphemism in its own way for wage theft and other forms of we could argue, is I don't want to say slavery, but is it not equitable labor practice? So if we're already operating in such a razor-thin margin where it's already tends to be too expensive to build in the United States, and if we simply paid people what they legally deserve, it becomes, we're crying about it being impossible to build anymore, period. It means we're already in a system where we're relying on that, right? So the question then becomes, how can we radically drive down the cost of construction? And I think that, regulation has so far never proven to be the way of driving down the cost of construction, right? So then it means, and automation hasn't really done it either, so I think that we're looking at perhaps really different ways of delivering buildings or reinventing the kind of organizations that provide buildings. And that's hard, but I think that's exciting terrain to be looking at.
Yeah, I mean, an exploited worker is a lot cheaper than a robot. That's one way to look at it.
Yeah.
I think one of the things, though, is thinking about, kind of what the underlying value proposition is. There is an area in the United States that was for 350 years or more one of the largest locations of enslavement in America, and that's what we euphemistically called the naval stores portion of the economy. Turpentine, pitch, et cetera. The British, that's a lot of the settlement of North Carolina is for that purpose. But then in the United States, you largely see it in Alabama and Florida over the last 150 years. And it's phenomenally abusive because these are not necessarily plantations. At first, it's actually going out and finding the right trees, cutting the stuff in it, letting the trees weep, collecting it, and then actually having to boil the sap and make it into turpentine, et cetera. So many cases in the 1800s after enslavement becomes illegal, so many cases, that's exactly where they are. The government starts doing procurement work in the progressive era saying we aren't going to support this anymore even though we need this for our ships. It doesn't end until somebody figures out, because of World War II and labor shortages, somebody figures out that there's a way to go in there with a cat, knock down the trees, boil them, distill them, and you're not going out there and having harvesting. So what it does is it actually not only destroys the market for enslaved African American workers in naval stores, which was a 400-year-old market by that point, but it also destroys the number of people that are working in the naval stores industry. But it turns out that 95% of them were exploited workers. And so it's not a net negative. I think what we see, and Transparentum, I think, really hit this early on in one of their first investigations is if you go and you start cleaning up the leather industry in Bangladesh, you are going to put 1 million people out of work if you don't clean it up correctly. So I think that unfortunately a lot of our let's use technology is more like that, where it could hurt people if we destroy that entire industry, as opposed to naval stores, which was that industry needed to be destroyed. The problem is we don't know which one's which right now.
All right, Ryan, you want to get in the last question, then we're going to break for lunch.
Sure. This question is for both Sheila and Bridget. You both presented ways to kind of bypass tier one manufacturers and ESG efforts and kind of elevate the stories of people directly working in trades. And I'm curious that I found the two approaches very complementary. One being hands-on interviews with the individual Syed, I believe, and the other working with large data sets of social media. Do you see a way in which those two methodologies can work in concert to deliver information, data, and insight to design professionals to help make better decisions?
So we use both. We have investigations, but then we also look at social media, and I won't go into the details of kind of what passes muster. I went to, there was a CVP Trade Expo a couple years ago with all these different data platforms. Verite was there, talking about different methods that they have. I mean, part of it is just going through a whole bunch of data that the suppliers provide, also using AI. I have no idea how they do that. So I think that there are ways perhaps to use a provider maybe like that, and then also using something like a CSO, who's doing actual investigation. So not an auditor, unless you know that there's an assessor that is, quite good and knows exactly what they're doing. So I think there is a way to scale up, and I don't think it would be completely overwhelming, because you'd also be just looking at the areas which are highest risk. We all know what these are, right? We have the iLab risk, which is with the iLab list, which is not about risk, it's about kind of documented issues. I, of course, look at the TIP report, which I used to help write, where I think you can see when you're like reading through the narratives what risks are. So I think there's a way to kind of put all the different things that are out there and tie it in one, if a company is really interested in looking at things. And we work a lot with companies, and some of the ones have very sophisticated measures of knowing exactly who their suppliers are, tracing them, having programs, trying to bring in other buyers to resolve problems. We still find the problems, right? So like they haven't solved it, but there are definitely companies that are doing a better job, and many that are doing a terrible job.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a way. I think I always, as someone who spent most of my career representing individual survivors, I just always worry that asking workers to do anything incentivizes exploiters to cut off that thing and be more coercive. And that I just may be too cynical at this point. I own that. But I personally am really energized and interested right now in not creating new data sets, not asking people for more things, but just figuring out what's already out there that we haven't leveraged in the fight. And so that's, and maybe things that, are in areas where companies aren't as incentivized, those sorts of things. And I think that's really, we've talked a little bit, I love how many of us are working with students, but that's actually really great spaces for students to spend time in when you can get them out of the pit of despair, because you're asking them to work in ambiguity, which law students, maybe other students too, hate. They want the answer. But if we can structure universities as spaces where we can actually bring together multiple disciplines to use different sets of tools to try to say what can we create from what is, but what hasn't been yet. And so, yeah, I'm hopeful about that, cynical maybe about the other stuff.
Historians love ambiguity.
I just need to get more historians.
David, that's why you're here. You're our chief ambiguity officer. Okay, so we're gonna break for lunch. After lunch, we're going to pick up a conversation about the last big major transformation in the building industry, which is the sustainability movement, and see what we can learn from that, from the lessons of that movement. So we're going to break for lunch for about 50 minutes and reconvene at 1:15. Thank you.